It seems extremely easy to do time-lapse this day. What do you need? You just need a phone and then you just do a few taps and then you just take time-lapse. What else is it?
Yeah, this looks alright, isn't it? But my iPhone X don't do 4K time-lapse, this is 1080 only. Also, when you start noticing noise in low lights and overblown, when you want to make better time-lapse, and do you know how others make this smooth motion blur time-lapse? And how about this? And how about total control on exposure and white balance? Well, it's really not that difficult if you follow my easy to follow guide.
Of course, I'm talking about using an actual camera to do this kind of time-lapse. Just like this, Nikon Z7 II. And this video is sponsored by Nikon Hong Kong. So that's why I'm speaking Nikon, not Nikon or Nikon, because we call Nikon in Hong Kong and it's sponsored by Nikon Hong Kong. Deal with it. In this video, I'm using this brand new Nikon Z7 II, but it doesn't have to be a Nikon, obviously. It applies to all other cameras. But then Nikon is a really good choice for time-lapse because most Nikon camera has a really featureful built-in time-lapse feature. So just let's get to it. Oh yeah, I'm using the gimmicky peak design tripod. Oh, it's wobble a lot. Well, it's light. Try carry this for taking public transport for 2 hours. Anyway, let's get to it. Now, turn on the camera and then, now from here I have to design the camera setting first. The first thing I'm going to think of is the motion blur. Because it's probably just for me, but I like, especially in this situation when car passing by, I like to have motion blurs. In time-lapse, because they appear to be moving so fast, I think with motion blur they look more natural. Doesn't really make factual sense, but this makes artistic sense. So now I will think of, according to this car speed, how long the motion blur that I want. I will think like 1, 2, maybe 1 second. Yeah, I think 1 second is good. From here, if I dial in 1 second of shutter speed, of course it will be really bright. Even though the ISO is already the lowest, the lowest, and I don't want to use too much aperture in case there's a deflection problem, make the image softer. So I would have to use anti-filter. Correct exposure would be around f22. So 1, 2. Maybe I can use a 2-stop anti-filter. Well, of course you can use variable anti-filter, but then I like to use fixed ND. The image quality is much better with just fixed ND. Now there's two time-lapse movie and interval timer shooting. Time-lapse movie only give you a movie, but interval shooting, you get raw photos if you're shooting raw. Now in here, you can have time-lapse movie as well. So if you use interval shooting, you will have each individual photo plus a movie. Now if I set 1 second, which is like between each shot, it will wait 1 second. 1 second between each shot. But I'm using 1 second exposure, so I'm worried the camera can't keep up. So I will set 2 second interval. And you can get started.
By the way, I'm using M mode. The exposure shouldn't change in this situation, as I don't want the camera to do anything stupid. It's in manual focus as well, instead of letting the camera focusing every single time, and the focus might shift a little bit between shots. Another thing to consider is that I usually use time-lapse between transition or for an ending, this kind of thing, so I usually only need 10 to 15 seconds of time-lapse. 25 frames per second, 15 seconds, that means I only need 375 individual shots. When this is done, the camera will create a time-lapse movie. Now this movie is straight from the camera built in. The great thing is that you can immediately see if your time-lapse is a success or not. If you compare this to the one that I've done with an iPhone, this looks so amateur. Plus my iPhone 10 doesn't do 4K time-lapse. This is just 1080. But this doesn't have to be the final product because you have all the raw photos. You can do better than this. Here are all the 446 raw photos from all the whole time-lapse while interval shooting. It's not a time-lapse yet. But of course with these raw photos you can edit it. You can edit the brightness, you can edit the white point, bring out shadow and highlight this and that, saturation. After I've done one of them, select all and sync all the settings to all the photos because they are all the same exposure. And now let's take a look. This is from the camera itself and this is from all the raw photos. So much better and so pro.
Now, as I mentioned, it got a really featureful time-lapse feature. Now how featureful? I'm going to show you. Choose start date and time. I just use now because I was going to start shooting right away, but then you can choose date and time as well. This is great. This is great for example, shooting sunset or sunrise. You don't have to be there to wait. Another really great thing is this starting storage folder. I don't know why it's called starting storage folder. It could be just storage folder. In here, you can have it to start a new folder for every single time lapse. This is really convenient, and it can also reset file numbering. So then for every single time lapse, it will be in each folder, and each of them start with file number 001 or something. So this is really tiny, really convenient when you have to actually make your time lapse back home. Now the second one, I'm going to do a day to night time lapse because it's now day and then later with light. Yeah, because I'm up here. Look at that. This is great. This is great, isn't it? Have been here several times actually. Getting a little bit cheesy here, but if you're not in Hong Kong, yeah, this is great. Look at that. So this time it's the same as before. I would use manual focus because there's nothing moving here, so there's no need for the camera to keep focusing every single time. Now this time I'm using A mode because I'm doing day to night. The exposure will change. I'm using auto ISO and of course I'm using A mode, so the camera would decide shutter speeds for me, and then I'm using f5 because it's an f4 lens. I don't want to use wide open. I want to stop down a little bit, so a little bit sharper in the main image, but then I don't want to use too small aperture because it will be light at the end of this time lapse. Shutter speed is quite high this time because there's not really much movement here in the frame. So I mean the only movement will be the sun, which is behind the cloud, and then the movement of cloud, and cloud moving so slow. You are not going to get motion blur on the cloud anyway. So I don't want cloud to have motion blur in my time lapse anyway. It doesn't look natural. Motion blur cloud. Now I'm using auto white balance. I'm shooting raw, so I can change the white balance later, and I will show you later how do I do smooth white balance changes. So now I only have to consider the sunset. I may be shooting this time lapse for 30 to 45 minutes in real time here, and I need around 300 shots. Just like before, I want just 10 seconds of time lapse. The result will be 10 seconds. So 300 shots divide to 30 to 40 minutes. That would be yeah, 6 seconds interval. Yes, 6 seconds. Okay, so start. There we go. We're shooting the time lapse now. Every 6 seconds.
So now just wait, because I'm using A mode, so I expect when it's getting dark, the shutter speed will get slower and slower. But then it's not slow enough.
So I'm a bit regret of my setting I was using. I'm still using A mode. I forgot that whenever you use A mode, P mode on a camera, it won't choose actually really slow shutter speed because it in case you are hand-holding the camera, the sun is already set. I was expecting that it will change to slower shutter speed, so I would get some motion blur of those cars over there. Yeah, totally forgot, I was wrong. So I'm going to risk it and change mode mid time-lapse.
Oh, this is dangerous though. But what I didn't know is actually Nikon lets you change mode in the middle of interval shooting.
That's pretty cool. Now it's in S mode, so I think I will try to set the shutter speed slower and slower gradually. So yeah, as you can see, I don't really have that much experience on doing time-lapse, and yeah, that's YouTube for you. Yeah, YouTuber. Oh.
Okay, at the end, this is the time-lapse movie that created by the camera itself. Now there's one problem, as you can see, it doesn't really get dark because the camera with auto exposure, it's always try to maintain the same exposure. Also at the end, you can see the cars on the main road get overblown. But there's one open secret between people who like to do time-lapse, which is this LR time-lapse software. The concept is that it works with Adobe Lightroom. Now here I don't want to spend too much time to talk about how to use LR time-lapse, but on their website they have really great instruction, step by step how to use it. Basically, after you know the whole folder into LR time-lapse, it will analyze the exposure in your whole time-lapse. And because you are working with raw file, it can save all the settings into each raw file metadata. After that, you go to Adobe Lightroom, read all the settings from the metadata back into Lightroom, and then you adjust all the keyframes. Basically, you adjust your first keyframe, adjust the exposure, color, whatever that you want. Copy these settings into all the remaining keyframes. One after one, you edit all the keyframes, basically the key moments during the whole time-lapse. After you save those settings into the metadata, the LR time-lapse will read them, and then based on all the keyframes that you set, it will gradually apply changes to all the photos. The results are perfectly smooth gradually from day to night changes. At the end, once again, load all these changes into Lightroom and then export all these frames, bring them back into your video editor and combine your time-lapse. And this is the result, a 46 megapixel time-lapse, which you can punch in because this is from a Nikon Z7 II.
At last, motion time-lapse. Motion time-lapse is that the time-lapse got motion, so in the time-lapse, the camera would pan, something like that. That's exactly what I want to do. From here, pan, something like that. So usually you need a motion control thing to control your camera to do this time-lapse. But actually you can use a gimbal. This is like 2-in-1, multi-purpose. Also, if you need an excuse for new toy, gimbal, this is a gimbal and a motion control. Dual purpose. It do look a bit dangerous, but just be careful, like push it a little bit. Yeah, I think it's quite stable. So here also I have to consider what shutter speed I would use. Now this, I don't have to use the 1 second shutter speed. The speed are much faster. The car speed are much faster. Look at that. So unlike the first time-lapse I was using 1 second, I think I can use half a second maybe. And then also set the exposure accordingly. I still want to use quite a small aperture, so everything is in focus. So f8, and then I have to bump up the ISO. It's still in manual focus, so I have to focus it, obviously. But as you can see, I have a cable that connects the gimbal from the gimbal to the camera, because now I don't use the interval feature inside the camera. I use the gimbal to control the camera to take photo. And then in the gimbal, this is really great. This is a Manfrotto 220 gimbal, actually the same as another Feiyu gimbal, exactly the same which is funny, but here we got motion time-lapse feature. So I will have to set the time setting. You tell it the pan until how much time you want the pan until to finish. I would say, just like before, 10 minutes would be enough, but I want it to be a little bit on the safe side, 12 minutes. And then that's the interval, how many seconds or how many minutes before it's shot. Oh, it got an error because this dual is how long the gimbal will stop for your camera to take exposure. Now I have to set to 1 second because I am doing half a second exposure, and this will make sure the gimbal stop for 1 second for the camera to take the photo. Interval 2 seconds. After that, go back out root setting. This is really simple. Set the start point. How do you set the start point? Really easy. You just move the camera. And press OK. End point. Yep. OK. And it's doing its job. Now what it's doing is that now it will like move a little bit, command your your camera to take the photo, and then move again. And also because that dual setting, that 1 second dual setting, is that it will make sure between each shot is 2 seconds, but then after it moves, it will stay there for 1 second for your camera to take that half a second exposure, so that it don't ruin your photo. So when you have to make sure your gimbal, or if you're going to buy your new toy, you have to make sure your new gimbal has this feature, which is it take a photo, move, take a photo, and then move, rather than a continuously pan and tilt. This is really clever.
And this one, compared to the day to night, you can say this is actually even easier. The only setup you have to do is on the gimbal itself. You bring all the raw photos into Lightroom, edit just one of them, and then you can just apply one setting to all the photos and export them. And here's the result. So this is how you time-lapse. How do you get better time-lapse than your mobile phone time-lapse? I've also shown you how to do motion time-lapse, and some things looks difficult, which is a day to night, but in fact it is not that difficult. Now if you find this interesting, you have to check out this video on screen. How to do hyperlapse with a gimbal as well.